If you're hungry and searching for something, you are not alone. Otis Ledbetter wants to help you satisfy your heart's deepest longing with his book, Soul Hunger. Taking a look at the Bible, we'll see the importance of focus, and Cameron Swinney grew up with two loves, history and the art of welding, and how he combined them is grafting him into the Hall of Heroes. Coming up on episode 99 of Manly with Andy. Now joining the podcast, it's Otis Ledbetter, author of the book, Soul Hunger. It seems like people are searching for happiness in all the wrong places in our culture. So let's start with this. Can we pursue happiness? And what is the solution for that pursuit?
When I saw happiness, I had a hard time putting happiness in there because I hear so many people say, well, God, he was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Does he really want us happy? So answer the question, does he really want us happy? And when I got into the scriptures, I saw he really does. As a matter of fact, all of his Sermon on the Mount start with the word blessed, which, if you look, it's the Greek word makarios, which means happiness, but a happiness that cannot be satisfied through outward circumstances. It's a happiness that God puts in us. And so, we can go to Disneyland or Disney World because we're feeling unhappy. Our circumstances has made us unhappy. And we can go to Disneyland and we can forget them for a few hours, maybe a whole day, maybe 2 days while we're there. But when we walk to the car and grab the handle of the car, there are those things that create the unhappiness in us. And we want to be happy. As a matter of fact, in our Constitution, it says life, liberty, and what? The pursuit of happiness. Well, how do you pursue happiness? Well, God says, I've got a joy for you. And, we pursue happiness by pursuing gratifying circumstances, but we pursue joy by pursuing God. And when we pursue him and get his joy, which fulfills us, we see that we really have that happiness that we're looking for. Now, you can go to the work of the flesh, and the work of the flesh said, I can give you some cheap thrills. If you want happiness, there's a lot of things I can do for you. And, but those things are temporary, and we've got to keep that in our mind. They're temporary. And what happens to pursue happiness is they've got to become, once we pursue them and they make us happy, the same thing won't make us happy the next time. At Christmas, when my kids or my grandkids open their presents and the happiness that's going on in this room around that Christmas tree, 6 days later, we can't rewrap those presents and get that same happiness because that's already gone. That's already behind us. And that's what happens. So we've got to pursue something that gives us happiness again. And so it becomes more intense. And if we go to the works of the flesh, then we just make the works of the flesh, that uncleanness and that licentiousness, more and more intense and intense. And before we know it, we're sort of living in a dark place when God says, I'll give you my joy and it will be your strength. And it brings us happiness.
Hmm. And kind of on that same lines, in the chapter, The Hunger for Contentment, I thought it was kind of interesting you said this because I think so often I look at the Bible and I think, there's all these things that they say, don't do this, don't do that. But you talk about there's the habit of Scripture that many never understand. When the Bible exhorts us to put something off, what does it do? There's also another side to that too.
Well, I like what Paul said to Timothy. And Timothy was a young guy, and every young guy I've ever come in contact with, one of the things they want is contentment. And Paul, after saying that he has learned to be content in whatever state he is, I think it's a learned thing, according to Paul. Wherever I am, whatever state I'm in, even if it seems like a very unhappy place, I can be content. I've learned how to be content. And he also said to Timothy, I think 1 Timothy chapter 6, he said that godliness with contentment is great gain. Gain for what? That's the question. What great gain is it? Well, it's a great gain in our learning process to learn to be content. I took that hunger test that's at the end of the book, and it's also online. And my hunger was the hunger for contentment. I want to be content. I want peace. And God said that to the disciples when he told them he was going to leave them after they hooked their wagon to his star for 3 years. And he went into the upper room and said, I've got to leave, and where I'm going, you can't go right now. They had given up their careers, their life, and they had followed him, and it caused a stir, it caused an emotional stir. And he saw that. That emotion in that room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And to settle them down, he said, my peace I leave with you. Not as the world gives, because the world calls contentment the absence of conflict. But he said, it's not as the world gives, give I unto you. So let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. So what God wants for us to bring us that contentment, he wants us to be peaceful. He wants us to be untroubled, and he wants us to be unafraid. And he says that if you labor and you are heavy laden, you come to me and I'll give you rest. And we see contentment and rest as side by side. Beautiful things that he gives to us.
Something that I was really happy that you talked about, because it's so in the news all the time now, it is the hunger for justice. And you talk about the different names: criminal, environmental, restorative. And you talk about, the great news about Jesus. And I think sometimes people don't think of it this way, but God, he is the Chief Justice. Talk a little bit more about that.
The hyphenated justices, and I understand where people go because they're disconnected. They don't have any peace, their joy. They don't know where to find it, and so they get their feelings, not just their feelings hurt. I don't want to diminish the fact that justice is important. So they start talking about themselves. What kind of justice do I need? And so all of a sudden, justice has all these children, and we really don't need justice by any other name is still justice. In the book, I sort of it's like saying, what piece of the apple pie do you want? Do you want it from the left side or the right side or the north side or the south side? Apple pie is apple pie, so just tell me where you want it. I'll cut it for you. Justice is justice. And God is a God of justice. He is the Chief Justice. So he says, I will bring justice. So instead of us talking about all of these hyphenated names, he has two particular words in the scriptures that he uses to identify what he wants. One in the Old Testament is the Hebrew word mishpat. And you'll find that in Micah 6:8, where he says, what I want for you, I want you to love mercy, and I want you to do justly, or I want you to have justice. And that's important to God. And then walk humbly before your God. That's the word mishpat, which means punish the wrongdoer. In the Old Testament, that's what you did. Somebody did something wrong, punishment was executed speedily, to them. They would take them outside the camp, whatever, when they found it, when they were judged. It was executed speedily. That's punish the wrongdoer. You cross over the 400 years of silence into the New Testament, and you get a different word, and it is the word tzedakah. And it is the kind of justice that God wants us to have. It's a self-cleansing justice. In other words, nobody else needs to come in and tell you that you're not acting justly. You should notice that yourself. You should notice God so well, and your relationship with him should be so close that you notice when you're not doing justly, or when you're not doing tzedakah, that self-cleansing justice. And the thing about it is, if we all had tzedakah, the self-cleansing justice, there wouldn't be any need for any other kind of justice, because we would be living in a right relationship with those around us as well as ourselves. So justice is really important. And I think it is something we're going to hear for a while in our country. And I think if we get it correct, let's take the two: punishing the wrongdoer, that's the Old Testament; self-cleansing justice in the New Testament, and let's live in a right relationship with others. And then we don't need all of those hyphenated ones.
I also like just a little long, the next page in your Hunger for Justice chapter. We need to ask ourselves 3 vital questions of faith.
I told my church as I was speaking on this, I said, there are 3 questions that we need to ask ourselves. Every Christian needs to ask ourselves when something happens to us that we don't understand. I hear people, they'll come to me and they'll say, why did my grandma have to die? Well, if she had to die, why did God have to let her suffer the way she suffered? And, Andrew, those are all impossible questions for me to answer because I don't know the mind of God completely. And I don't know why he does what he does. And sometimes what he does seems like an injustice to us, but I know it's not because he's not an unjust God. And so I told him there are 3 questions that we should ask ourselves. And the first one is this: do I truly believe God is in control? Yes, I do, they say to me. Then, do I truly believe that God is good? Yes, Pastor, I believe that. Well, then the third thing is, are you willing to wait until God can verify to me the answer to the first 2 questions? And there's a long pause when you come to that third question. Am I willing to wait until he can prove to me that he is in control and that he is good? And I think, well, that helps me. And I think that'll help any of us if we can answer yes to all 3 of those.
Speaking of control, in your chapter, The Hunger for Control, you talk about an analogy that maybe someone has heard before, but I think it's really powerful, about forgiveness and cups and what happens when they spill and overflow.
I first heard that. I saw it in a blog lately, and I even talked to the editor, my copy editor, about it because we want to give credit where it is. The credit I would give is to one of my mentors, Henry Brandt. Henry Brandt was one of the first Christian psychologists way back in the 40s and the 50s, and we became good friends. He taught me this. He told me this story, how he got control of the anger that's within him. He realized in his relationship with God that person over there did not make me angry. They triggered the anger that's already inside me. My wife does not have the ability to make me angry. My boss does not have the ability to make me angry, he said. The person on the street that bumps into me does not have the ability to make me angry. And he wrote this in his book back in the 1950s, this same illustration you're talking about. And I used it as I was talking to a young lady who had come in for counseling, who was a very, very angry person. And I asked her, and in the book, I think I call her Teresa, which is not her name, but I have permission to use her story. My vice is Diet Coke. And actually on that day, I had a Diet Coke sitting there. And I asked her, I said, Teresa, if I bumped this Diet Coke here and it turned over, what would spill out of it? And she looked at me like it was a trick question. I said, no, really, it's a Diet Coke. What would spill out of it? She said, well, Diet Coke would. I said, well, if I bumped it, why wouldn't coffee spill out of it? Or if I bumped it, why wouldn't orange juice spill out of it? She said, because Diet Coke's what's in it. And I said, that's exactly right. When we have anger, when we allow anger to stay inside us and somebody bumps our emotional cup or turns over whatever we have saved that anger in, what will spill out? Kindness won't spill out because kindness is not what is in there. Anger spills out because anger is what was in there. And then people want to come to me and say about anger, but God was angry. And I say to them, well, you can't equate your anger with God's anger. Because if God had the same anger I have, then God was guilty of the works of the flesh. And I'm saying that God had sinned. When he says be angry and sin not, what he's doing is getting us to look at the kind of anger he has, not the kind of anger we have. He's not allowing us to pour our wrath out on somebody. And anger, it's interesting. anger in the works of the flesh is the only work of the flesh that gets management classes. You know, we say, if you're angry, go to management class. God says, he says to us, it's not managing the anger. I want you to put it away. He says that in Ephesians 4:31. You put anger away from you. You put all evil speaking. You put wrath away from you. You put clamor away from you. You put bitterness away from you. You put that away. And he said, be ye kind one to another. And if you notice on where anger is on the issue of control, that's the hunger we're trying to feed. Teresa said to me, Pastor, when I get angry, I can handle any situation. I can control any situation when I get angry enough. But God says kindness. And he says that in that Ephesians 4:31. So they say to me, well, how do I put away anger? If I'm not supposed to manage it, how do I put it away? And I say to them, you know what? If you left on vacation, before you left, you were going to make yourself a hamburger, and you left some beef, hamburger meat out on the counter. When you came back after a 2-week vacation, what you would find is the smell of death, and you'd find maggot-infested meat. And I would say to you, don't cook that, don't eat that, because if you participate in that piece of meat that's rotten, you're going to get sick. And I would say to you, put that meat away from you. You wouldn't have any question on how to put that meat away from you. You would take it out to the garbage. You'd wrap it. You'd take it in the garbage and put it in your garbage. You might put it in your neighbor's garbage. You know how to get it far away from you, because you know there's danger in that. There's danger in anger. Put it away from you, he says, and replace it with kindness. And that's a difficult task, but it's one that we ought to be attempting at every turn in our life.
Talking with J. Otis Ledbetter, Soul Hunger, great book, just talking about the different hungers that you have and how to dig deeper with it. You know, God's given us hunger for a reason, but it's just about finding the right way to go about it. And I think this one can be so difficult, Otis. Towards the end of the book, you talk about the hunger for achievement.
Yeah.
And we all have that hunger, but there's a right way and a wrong way to go about things. And you talk about the priority of how.
Yeah, it really is. We all want to achieve. And because we want to achieve, God gave us some scriptures, particularly he said, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. And in other words, if you're going to achieve. Don't be half-hearted. That hunger you have for achievement, he put it there. So when you know that's God's will, and when you know that's the direction you should go, and when you've measured everything, go that direction. And we think achievement, that the fruit of the Spirit that corresponds with achievement is gentleness. I doubt that any of us, Andrew, have ever read a book on leadership that goes from the angle of achievement, of gentleness. It is, leadership. You've got to take control. You've got, all these things. I think somebody ought to write a book on leading through gentleness, because you see, gentleness is not an imperative for Christians to underachieve. We think if I'm gentle, then it won't get done. It's not an imperative for Christians to underachieve. Rather, it's a counterintuitive means to achievement that is richly satisfying. And God is counterintuitive a lot of ways. He says, the first shall be last. Well, what does that mean? If I run to get first in line, you mean I'm going to be last? If you want to be greatest in the kingdom, you have to be least. If you want to be a leader, you have to be a servant. That's counterintuitive. In this, it's also counterintuitive that if you want to really achieve, you do it through gentleness. As a matter of fact, David wrote in the Psalms, your gentleness has made me great. And Jesus himself said, you come to me because I am gentle and I am lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. But the works of the flesh says, how about envy and murders? A friend of mine down in the Florida area, he built a mega church. And we've done we're good friends. We've gone on vacations together, done a lot of trips together, cruises. And I got a phone call from him last year. and I was just sitting watching some football and trying to take a Saturday off. And the phone rang, and it was him. And so I answered it. I said, "Hey, what's up?" And I could tell by his voice that it wasn't going to be a pleasant social call. And he just said his wife's name and said she left me. After 47 years of marriage, she left him. And I, shocked, you know, when I got my senses about me, I asked, well, why? Why did she leave me? He says, I don't have a clue. While I was talking to him, my call waiting rang on my cell phone, and I saw her name. It was his wife calling me at the same time he was calling. And so I went ahead with my conversation with Barry. That's his name in the book. And when I hung up with him, I called her. And she told me this. She said, I've lived with an angry man all of my life, and I'm not going to live with an angry man anymore. And so I'm done. I'm gone. Well, it wasn't anything I could do, but I asked him, would you submit to taking the evaluation that's in my Soul Hunger book? And she said, yes. So I sent it to her. And I called Barry back and asked him the same thing. And he said, yes. So I sent it to him. I got Barry's, his evaluation back, and there wasn't any sign in his answers of control or anger. There wasn't any sign in there. In fact, there was a 0 on that where he that number that corresponded with control. There was a 0 there. He didn't have any. And so I had, when I got his evaluation, I saw underachievement. It was sky high. That was up around 15. And then I began to talk to him. And what I saw was his achievement was off the charts. He wanted to build a church. He wanted to build a mega church. And he was told by his former pastor that if you marry her, you'll never achieve anything. I mean, that's what his pastor told him. But he married him anyway. Out of spite, he married her anyway. And now he's asking some questions. And then he said to me, he said, Otis, on this evaluation, you got me down here with envy and murders on the works of the flesh. I said, Barry, I don't have you anywhere. Those aren't my answers, my guesses. Those are your answers. And he says, but I'm not a murderer. I said, well, you can kill a lot of things besides murder. In fact, as a matter of fact, when Jesus came on the scene, he raised that word to a different level, that if you hate your brother, you're guilty of murder. And you can have character murder or reputation murder. As a matter of fact, your wife told me that you killed all of the love she has for you. So as we looked into it, and in his stories in the book, what he found out was, in his desire to achieve, it was so great, and he was envious of everybody else who had built a large church. It was fueled with envy, and envy and ambition is a dangerous combination. And that's what happened. And although he wasn't angry at her, he ran over her just by virtue of his want to achieve and to build that church that he was told he could never build. And when he saw that, and as a matter of fact, I just was with him a few days ago, and he said, that realization has absolutely changed my life. And his wife has come back and asked him to forgive her. And so it's a very interesting achievement. Be careful with that achievement. When you do achieve, listen to Jesus' counterintuitive words. Gentleness. Your gentleness has made me great. And stay away from the envy and the killings and the murderers and that sort of thing. And I think the achievement, that hunter will be so satisfactorily.
All right, one last question. J. Otis Ledbetter, his book, Soul Hunger, and you talk about the hunger for pleasure. You use a word that I don't think really is used much anymore, temperance. It's kind of the solution to the hunger for pleasure.
I use that word. The reason I use that word is it describes what needs to go on more than self-control. Because self-control means I have decided to just control something. I'm not going to get rid of it. I'm going to control that. In this situation, I'm going to control it. I may need that anger later, so I'm not going to put it away. I'm sort of going to self-control it. I don't think that says what temperance says. Temperance means self-mastery. You have mastered the self in you. You have learned to deny self. You have learned to master self, that it isn't even around. You're not keeping it to use it later. Self-mastery. So that's the reason I use that word. And when it comes to pleasure, again, when I saw that hunger and said pleasure, my first reaction was, no, that's not a hunger God gives us. God doesn't give us those pleasures. He doesn't give us pleasure. We look for those ourselves. And again, I felt a little sacrilegious putting it in there, until I looked into the scriptures and saw there's not one scripture in the Bible, not one sentence in the Bible that talks about pleasure is bad, pleasure is wrong, that he gives. As a matter of fact, in Psalm, I think it's 1636, he says to us about pleasures, he says, you will show me the path of life. Psalm 16:11. You will show me the path of life, and in your presence is fullness of joy, and at your right hand are pleasures forevermore. And so the pleasures he gives to us so we can enjoy him and enjoy the life he's given us. And what we tend to do when the devil comes along, he says, look, I can take those pleasures and I can make them more real to you. And because the devil is so successful in making those pleasures real to us, we have a tendency to kind of give him all of the lion's share of the word pleasure. We think it comes from him when it doesn't. It actually comes from God, and it comes through self-mastery, temperance.
Now taking a look at the Bible, picking it up in Joshua 8, Verse 1, Then the Lord said to Joshua, Do not be afraid or discouraged. Take all your fighting men and attack Ai, for I have given you the king of Ai, his people, his town, and his land. You will destroy them as you have destroyed Jericho and its king. But this time you may keep the plunder and livestock for yourselves. Set an ambush behind the town. So Joshua and all the fighting men set out to attack Ai. Joshua chose 30,000 of his best warriors and sent them out at night with these orders. Hide in ambush close behind town and be ready for action. When our main army attacks, the men of Ai will come out to fight as they did before, and we will run away from them. We will let them chase us until we have drawn them away from the town. For they will say, The Israelites are running away from us, as they did before. Then, while we are running from them, you will jump up from your ambush and take possession of the town, for the Lord your God will give it to you. Set the town on fire, as the Lord has commanded. You have your orders. So they left and went to the place of ambush between Bethel and the west side of Ai. But Joshua remained among the people in the camp that night. Early the next morning, Joshua roused his men and started toward Ai, accompanied by the elders of Israel. All the fighting men who were with Joshua marched in front of the town and camped on the north side of Ai, with a valley between them and the town. That night Joshua sent about 5,000 men to lie in ambush between Bethel and Ai on the west side of town. So they stationed the main army north of the town and the ambush west of the town. Joshua himself spent that night in the valley. When the king of Ai saw the Israelites across the valley, he and all his army hurried out early in the morning and attacked the Israelites at a place overlooking the Jordan Valley. But he didn't realize there was an ambush behind the town. Joshua and the Israelite army fled toward the wilderness as though they were badly beaten. Then all the men in the town were called out to chase after them. In this way, they were lured away from the town. There was not a man left in Ai or Bethel who did not chase after the Israelites, and the town was left wide open. Then the Lord said to Joshua, Point the spear in your hand toward Ai, for I will hand the town over to you. Joshua did as he was commanded. As soon as Joshua gave the signal, all the men in ambush jumped up from their position and poured into the town. They quickly captured it and set it on fire. When the men of Ai looked behind them, smoke from the town was filling the sky, and they had nowhere to go. For the Israelites who had fled in the direction of the wilderness now turned on their pursuers. When Joshua and all the other Israelites saw that the ambush had succeeded and that smoke was rising from the town,
they turned and attacked the men of Ai. Meanwhile, the Israelites who were inside the town came out and attacked the enemy from the rear. So the men of Ai were caught in the middle, with Israelite fighters on both sides. Israel attacked them, and not a single person survived or escaped. Only the king of Ai was taken alive and brought to Joshua. It's easy to fall into mission creep in our life. That's why I love this example of an incredible battle strategy here in the Bible. You notice that in those verses, God says, point your spear toward Ai, and Joshua does it immediately, and that's when everything starts falling into place. And this entire plan only works because everyone sticks to their role and stays focused. The ambush team doesn't get antsy and blow their cover. The main army doesn't actually run away in panic. And Joshua, he's locked in, keeping his spear raised until the job is done. So how often do we get distracted mid-mission? Maybe you started out strong this year. This was the year where things were going to change. But now, as you are reaching the end, you've lost sight of the end game because something else took your focus, or something that people wanted you to focus on took precedent. The tyranny of the urgent, right? You just keep putting out little fires in your life so you can't focus on the bigger plan. Staying focused on your role, your goal, and God's plan is key. And in the story, Joshua trusted God's timing. He stuck to the strategy and didn't get sidetracked by the chaos of the moment. So whatever you're trying to manage in your life, remember that focus isn't just about avoiding distractions. It's about staying, as my kids would say, locked in on what God's called you to do. Keep your eyes on the prize and don't put the spear down until the mission's complete. Now entering the Hall of Heroes, Cameron Swinney. Who grew up with two loves, history and the art of welding. From the time he was a teenager, you could find him tinkering with classic cars, his hands covered in grease and metal dust. But while most people settle for just restoring old automobiles, Cameron had something bigger in mind, much bigger. You see, Cameron's passion wasn't just about cars, it was about creating something extraordinary. So armed with a budget of $50,000, his self-taught engineering skills, and a bit of grit, Cameron set out to build a life-sized, working replica of a World War I tank. He chose the FT-17, an iconic tank considered to be the world's first modern combat vehicle. So with steel plates, tractor treads from the 1930s, and a Jeep engine to power his project, Cameron constructed the 12,000-pound beast right in his own backyard. Today, this mini killdozer, as Cameron affectionately calls it, sits proudly on his lawn, rattling and rumbling like a scene straight out of Mad Max. And although it's restricted to private property by California law, his tank has won over neighbors and history buffs alike. It even snagged a Best in Show title at a car show. And Cameron, he's just getting started. So because he's proving that sometimes our wildest ideas lead us to victories we never imagined, he is officially in the Manly with Andy Hall of Heroes. Spiritual warfare is real, and Derek Mason has your plan to victory. A treaty in the Bible shows the importance of always checking with God first, and Henry Sager's dedication to preserving the joy of chocolate is baking him into the Hall of Heroes. Coming up next time on Manly with Andy. Manly with Andy is a Wow God production. Discover more at wowgod.com.